My name is Rachel Schneider, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in the Religion and Public Life program here at Rice University. We at the program are so grateful for the opportunity to partner with several entities to host tonight's important conversation on race and evangelical politics. So thank you to Rice's Department of Political Science, Rice's Department of Sociology, and to Fuller Theological Seminary, Texas. A few brief words about the Religion and Public Life program. Our vision is to use research on religion to build common ground for the common good. We accomplish our vision through research, training, and outreach. So please visit our website at rplp.rice.edu to learn more. Now I'd like to introduce you very briefly to our three panelists. Richard Mouw is Professor of Faith and Public Life at Fuller Theological Seminary. Prior, he served as Fuller's president from 1993 to 2013. Jason Shelton is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas at Arlington. He is also the Director of the Center for African American Studies there. And Janelle Wong, a political scientist, is a professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland. She is a core faculty member in their Asian American Studies program. For more biographical information on our esteemed panelists, please look in your program. I am grateful for each of them giving their time, their energy, and their expertise to us this evening. So tonight we are going to address race, evangelicalism, and politics. So first, before we begin, I want to offer a brief sociological lesson on the relationship between religion and politics to help frame our conversation tonight. So it'll be no surprise to you that religion and politics are intimately entwined in public life. Though the US legally mandates the separation between church and state, religious groups and individuals still play an important part in shaping political action. A September 2016 survey found that 18% of adults said that their religious beliefs influence their political beliefs a lot. And 75% of evangelical Christians say their religious beliefs have a lot of influence on their political beliefs. Religious congregations provide people with resources for political involvement in tangible forms like leaders, social networks, places to meet. They also provide people with intangible resources for political involvement, helping shape individual values and their interpretations of the world. Finally, certain religious identities can be equated with certain political affiliations, and these often overlap with other social locations and power structures, such as those related to race and racism. The relationship between religion and politics has slowly grown stronger since the 1980s. Roughly 70% of highly religious evangelical Christians and Mormons and 62% of highly religious mainline Protestants identify as Republican. By contrast, only 35% of highly religious Catholics and 14% of highly religious Black Protestants identify as Republican. White Christians are particularly likely to vote Republican. More than 1/3 of all Republicans identify as white, evangelical Protestant, and roughly 3/4 of all Republicans belong to a predominantly white religious group of some kind. In the 2016 election, white evangelical Christians voted 81% for Trump and 16% for Clinton. White Catholics voted 60% for Trump and 37% for Clinton, and other Protestants voted 58% for Trump and 39% for Clinton. At the same time, non-white Christians tend to lean more towards the Democratic Party. Perhaps the most religious group in the US, Black Protestants, largely identify as Democrats. In 2016, 88% of Black Protestants voted for Clinton, quite the contrast. Among Democrats and those who lean towards the Democratic Party, 95% of all people of color in that group say they believe in God or a higher power. Black Protestants in particular share many theological beliefs with evangelicals, but their social location leads them to prioritize different social issues, and thus they side with a different political party. While all these statistics are noteworthy, they don't tell us the full story of America's shifting social landscape and its impact on religion and politics, particularly within American evangelicalism. And I know our panelists are going to have a lot more to say about this tonight, but I do want to note a recent event that received much national attention. Christianity Today, a prominent evangelical magazine, published an editorial. I'm hearing the murmuring, so you all are familiar. Okay. So Christianity Today published this editorial that called for President Trump to be removed from office last month. The editor, Mark Galli, even went so far as to argue that it is one's Christian duty to remove Trump due to his moral failings. The editorial, which went viral and was read by thousands, and maybe some of you in this room, generated intense debate with some evangelical leaders and President Trump dismissing Christianity Today as a far-left publication, while others defended... Okay, I'm speaking to some insiders here. You all understand what this means. While others defended the editor's argument from a faith perspective. So regardless of one's view, the fact that the President of the United States responded directly to an editorial in Christianity Today in a tweet and then subsequently held an Evangelicals for Trump rally in Miami that drew about 7,000 people, it illustrates the central role, I think, that religion will likely play in the 2020 election. So I'm very excited to hear what some of the thoughts are about this tonight. So now let me just say a few words about tonight's flow. First, each of our panelists has prepared some remarks, so they are going to come up here one by one, reflecting from their different perspectives on the topics at hand. And then I have some questions prepared for them, and we'll engage in conversation together. And then finally, I will take questions from the audience. So please be thinking of your questions as they're presenting and we're having our discussion. So thank you. And Richard Mouw will be our first presenter.
Thank you, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be with you this evening, and especially to serve on this panel with Jason and Janelle. I met them for the first time this evening, but I told Janelle that I'm a fan of hers because when I heard her being interviewed on NPR, I immediately got her book and read it. We communicated a little bit. What an important topic, and I look forward to learning from them this evening. Just to give you 3 stages in my own personal journey on the issue of evangelicalism and race. When I was 7 years old, now how's that place to start? 7-year-old kid in New Jersey, 1947. I had just become a baseball fan, and I was an avid fan of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And that year, Jackie Robinson came into the major leagues, and I just loved Jackie Robinson. I thank God for Jackie Robinson because it put me on a journey. I had relatives, uncles, I remember sitting around who were very critical of him coming into the major leagues. You know, why don't these colored people learn to stay where they belong? That kind of attitude. And I wasn't articulate enough to argue with them, but secretly I was a very avid Jackie Robinson fan. 10 years later, when I was 17, I went with my dad to a church meeting in Pennsylvania that had people from all over the country, evangelical Christians, and they were debating whether to issue a statement in favor of open housing legislation. It was an all-white male group, except for one black elder in this particular denomination from Los Angeles, and he and his wife had traveled across the country for them to be at this meeting by car. And the debate went on for quite a while, and I mention this story because of the rhetoric of that debate. There was a very strong opposition to any support for legislation guaranteeing open housing, racial anti-discrimination kind of housing. And the arguments went something like this, and these were the two phrases that stuck in my mind. And one was, we don't need laws, we need love. And secondly, you cannot legislate morality. You know? And this was very, very prominent and went on. And toward the end of the debate, and just before the vote, the African-American elder stood up and said, my wife and I drove across the country, and there were 2 states along the way where we could not get anything to eat. We went into one restaurant, for example, he said, and there were many empty tables. But the waitress said, I'm sorry, all of our tables are taken. And immediately afterwards, we saw a white couple come in, and they were immediately seated. He said, yeah, I like the idea of love, and it would have been really nice if that waitress loved us, but what we really wanted were cheeseburgers. And that had a powerful impact on me because it was about the public access to public places, to cheeseburgers. It's not at all accidental in my mind that many of the early anti-racist, anti-segregationist actions were lunch counter events. Simply to have access to food, to have access to seats on buses, those kinds of issues. And thank God today, that couple would have been served cheeseburgers because there have been laws. And we've had a lot of legislation. But I'm going to say, as an evangelical Christian, and I've been really troubled by this lately, because I've often wondered whether that rhetoric was really masking an inability or an unwillingness to really deal with the fundamental issues of justice. And we've had a lot of legislation, but and that's great. But the legislation is very vulnerable. It's very fragile. And we're even seeing many of the good legislation that was implemented as a result of the civil rights movement being, if not actually revised or withdrawn, genuinely questioned by a lot of people. And I do believe that legislation was absolutely essential, no question about it. But as I think about the evangelical churches, suppose that waitress in what I think was probably Montana, suppose she belonged to an evangelical church. What has she been hearing lately that would help her not only obey the law, but actually to show love toward people who are different from herself? And these are the kinds of questions. And I'm convinced that while celebrating and fighting to maintain and sustain the legislative gains that we have made over the last several decades, that we also need to be working on what is called these days spiritual formation. Ronald Thiemann from Harvard Divinity School, the late Ron Thiemann, once wrote a wonderful essay in which he said that the local church should be a workshop in civility. It should be a place where we're formed for the kind of character that is necessary for the citizenship, for active engagement in public life. And I think this is where the evangelical churches have failed. My whole point about love and not laws, 10 years after that meeting, when I was 27 years old, I was actively, Phyllis and I had been active in civil rights activities, and I was writing about it, and I couldn't get that phrase out of my head, and so I wrote a thing, and my example was, take a racist nation like South Africa, where apartheid was the rule of the day. Suppose Billy Graham went to South Africa and preached the sermon one night, and everybody in South Africa responded by becoming evangelical Christians. They all got converted, became evangelical Christians. The next morning, there would still be a lot of work to do, because you've got a history that needs to be rewritten. You've got laws that need to be transformed. You've got relations that are structural, systemic in character that need to be addressed. Love is not enough. We do need to work for justice. But the formal systemic structures are also not enough. And one of the great challenges in contemporary evangelicalism, and I think in present day American life, is to deal with the issues of character, the issues of spiritual formation, of a sense of our bondedness with one another as citizens. And I hope that this evening we can address many of those issues. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being here. This is a packed house. Wow, this is really great. Honored to be here. I served as a postdoctoral fellow here at Rice from 2006 to 2008 in the Center for Race, Religion, and Urban Life with Dr. Michael Emerson. He's gone, I'm gone, and this is the first time I've been back, and it's great to be here. Shout out to Elaine Howard Eklund for the invitation here tonight. Wow, there's a whole lot to talk about with this topic. Uh-oh, what does that mean? What was that? Was that the good Lord? Like, yo, here we go. But seriously, when we talk about race and evangelical politics, we think of black folks and white folks on very different ends of the ideological continuum, right? That, as Rachel said, black folks overwhelmingly voting Democratic, white evangelicals overwhelmingly voting Republican, and that's sort of the tip of the iceberg. In terms of other political and social issues, Black Lives Matter, affirmative action, a whole host of things where these two groups of believers and Americans see issues completely differently, black and white, and very little gray area. But what if I told you that the fastest growing tradition within the black church is twice as likely to vote for Republican presidential candidates? What if I told you that with the passage of time over the last 50 years, more and more African Americans believe that the causes of racial inequality in this country are about black folks having a lack of motivation, and more African Americans saying that racial discrimination and structural inequality are less important to understanding the conditions facing African Americans in our society? You think I'd be running my mouth? I'd be telling you the truth, as I did earlier today in a presentation to the Department of Sociology. And for some people, it's a clear sign that the melting pot in America is bubbling. That if I was to put the data on the screen, that over the decades, more and more African Americans are embracing the traditional ideology of hard work and merit and anti-structuralism as causes of inequality in our society. That's the traditional dominant ideology in the United States of America. In a great number of ways, what we are finally seeing is black folks and white folks moving from the edges and finding an ideological middle ground. But I have to be honest and tell you, as much as great in theory as that sounds, I'm very concerned. Because, as I told the room earlier today, I'm a member of the Black Methodist tradition, right? That historic AME tradition. And we're essentially on our deathbed. 3 out of 100 African American adults are members of that tradition. The non-denominational Protestant tradition is the only tradition that has grown in Black America over the last 5 decades. And those are the folks who are twice as likely to vote for Republican presidential candidates. Not only that, but what we are also seeing is the movement, again, away from structural explanations, a move away from support for affirmative action, a move away from some pretty time-tested beliefs about the role of government as a solution to solving social problems. So on one end, I'm happy to see the melting pot in action. But on the flip side, the church that my family and I attend in South Dallas is in the middle of the hood. And I have this feeling that if I was to fast forward the clock 100 years from now, the young people that would be walking out of that church on a Sunday would still be in the middle of the hood, and they'd be explaining that the black people that live in those neighborhoods around them are lazy, that they don't work hard enough, and that they haven't done their fair share to capitalize on the American dream. So I'm divided in the sense that I believe in Dr. King's dream of a fellowship of humanity. In the first book that I wrote with Michael Emerson when I was here as a fellow, we talked about, the book is called Blacks and Whites in Christian America, and we talk about Dr. King's notion of the fellowship of humanity. And that's an important thing, but how do we solve the problem of racial inequality? And so where it might seem like the melting pot is bubbling, and it is, the pot is bubbling so fast and so hot that my fear is that we're going to have a group of black folks that are stuck at the bottom of American society, and there won't be a whole lot of us as black people to say, yo, we got your back. We're fighting for you. And religion, again, is a big theme here underlying some of these arguments related to politics in the black church today. We can talk more about that as we go. We can get into Trump. You know I want to talk about that. And some other stuff as well. But again, it is an honor to be here tonight, and I look forward to the discussion.
Wow, those are two very hard acts to follow. Thank you so much for having me here. I really want to especially thank Dr. Elaine Howard-Eklund and the RLPL staff. Who's RLPL staff here? Thank you so much for the organizing. So I've been studying evangelicals for the past decade with a particular eye towards growing numbers of immigrant evangelicals, primarily from Asia and Latin America. And I came to this project wondering how will those groups impact the traditional Christian right? This question was prompted by the ways in which demographic change have really transformed the U.S. more generally. How is that demographic change going to affect evangelical churches? As many of you know, white evangelicals are a shrinking proportion of the U.S. population. So in the U.S. in 2008, this group made up about 20% of the U.S. population. By 2018, white evangelicals made up 15% of the U.S. population. But Asian American and Latinx evangelicals are still growing in numbers. In fact, this group represents the only source of significant growth in evangelical America. And these two groups, despite holding very similar attitudes to their white evangelical counterparts on abortion and same-sex marriage, they look much different from white evangelicals when it comes to almost every other political issue. So there is a racial divide in evangelical America. On the one hand, white evangelicals were the most likely to vote for Trump. On the other hand, non-white evangelicals, blacks, Latinx, and Asian Americans, no majority of those populations voted for Trump. This also goes for Republican Party identification, climate change, healthcare, taxes, Black Lives Matter, immigration, all of it. So my hypothesis was that growing numbers of Asian American and Latinx evangelicals were going to change the white evangelical political agenda. How could they not, with the demographic patterns being what they were? Or I thought maybe Asian American and Latinx evangelicals would start to march lockstep with their white evangelical counterparts. This was another possibility, and sort of shore up even more this conservative agenda. But I was wrong on both of those counts. Actually, white evangelicals, to my surprise, during the course of this research, actually doubled down on anti-immigrant attitudes. And this occurred even as white evangelical leaders, national leaders, were becoming more and more visibly and vocally progressive on, let's say, a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. As white leaders in the evangelical church started to become more progressive, the rank and file, our data show, actually suggests that white evangelicals at the rank and file level started to become even more conservative on immigration. So the question I return to is why the majority of conservative white evangelicals maintain political power even in the face of massive demographic change. So one answer is mobilization. While the white evangelical population has been shrinking and is now 15% of the population, throughout the last 10 years, they have comprised 25% or 26% of the electorate. So this has been consistent over time. They are punching way above their weight. And race is at the center of this mobilization. I say this because my research and studies by many others shows that even after we account for big movers in political attitudes, like party identification and socioeconomic status, we see that feelings of being racially embattled drive the conservative agenda of white evangelicals. That is, even accounting for party ID and socioeconomic status, race plays a separate role in those conservative attitudes, not only in terms of their support for Trump and anti-immigrant attitudes, but also beliefs on taxes, the environment, and healthcare. Race is such a big driver of these attitudes that I found in a survey of more than 10,000 people that whites who are not evangelical are more conservative and more likely to have voted for Trump than evangelical Blacks, Latinx, and Asian Americans who are not religious. What I found is also that if someone who is white and evangelical lives in New York City, they're still more likely to have supported Trump than Mexican American evangelical in rural Texas. So race is playing a very big role there. So let's talk about it.
These are very provocative opening remarks, coming from really different perspectives, so I'm looking forward to having you all dialogue with one another and dialogue with me. But maybe just to begin for you to ask the entire panel, what does the label evangelical Christian then mean to you in light of kind of the very different kinds of populations and trends that you were all talking about?
It's been an argument among evangelicals for most of my life. We had, in the 1970s at Wheaton College, they established the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicalism, and I would say our annual conferences for the first 7 years, we debated what it meant to be an evangelical, although all of us there work, claimed to be. It got sort of solved by a British scholar who wrote a book, David Bebbington, who set forth what we've come to know as the Bebbington Quadrilateral. That is the 4 features that he says are essential. And one is conversionism, or really more basically a personal relationship with Christ. Secondly, the supreme authority of the Bible as our supreme authority. Thirdly, a cross-centered, he said crucicentric, a cross-centered, that Jesus died for me on the cross, and without the work of the cross, we'd be in big trouble. And then finally, an activism that has always been, we got to all be active in evangelism, and that also can include social concerns, working for justice. Obviously, the more conservative causes like abortion and the like. So those 4 things, and I want to say they're emphases, because I spoke out here in Texas at a Catholic university, and they wanted me to talk about what is an evangelical. I used those 4, and the Catholic theologian, the priest who was my host, said, but I believe, I can hold to all 4 of those. Maybe the Bible alone, but we can even work around that one and come across sounding okay on the subject. But it's really, those are the things we want to argue about. They're not just things that we happen to hold to, but they're big issues for us. And so it's emphases that we take seriously, as opposed to, say, in Catholicism, where the centrality of the Eucharist or celibacy of the priesthood might be things that would be more prominent in a person's thinking, or the papal infallibility. So anyway.
My answer's short.
Mine too.
Okay. So I come to that definition really through an ethnic studies lens. I was talking to Jason earlier, and I came into studying religion after many years of studying race. And my research really strives to see this group, white evangelicals, for instance, or anyone who identifies as evangelical, through their racial identity. And I am most deeply concerned about how race matters within that broad religious identity. That said, in my research, I let people identify themselves. So anyone that I study who is identified as evangelical, it's because they have identified themselves as either evangelical or as born again. And that obviously is a flawed measure, because they might adhere to many of these emphases, these beliefs, but they may not call themselves or self-identify as evangelical.
I tend to agree with that. As a statistical researcher, we hang out with surveys a lot, and in order to really track and create a measure for a respondent who views him or herself as evangelical, we look at a number of things that have already been said. But if, for example, on a survey, if people say yes, that they have been reborn, right, reborn in Christ as adults, that's one of those measures. Also, the literal interpretation of the Bible, right, is a critical one as well, that the Bible is infallible. So there are questions on surveys that allow people to sort of say their views about the Bible. And then evangelism, I mean, getting out there and spreading the word, the good news. And so, of course, you'll find on surveys that not all Christians say that they do those things.
Yeah, right.
And so so the folks that say no, there's a clear distinction between those who say yes. And so statistically, that's sort of how we get at some of that.
Yeah. So talk to me, though, a little bit about Black Protestants in this group in light of the term evangelical. So how can we have, Black, white Southern Baptist and Black Methodist sometimes being sort of seen as part of the same group?
So, as you know from earlier today, I would say Black Methodist is not in that definition of evangelical, right? One of my big qualms is that social scientists, we tend to lump all Black folks together, and we do this statistically in a number of ways. Sort of the greatest coding scheme since in social science research for measuring religion, RELTRAD, And Jerry knows what I'm about to say, so it's not a big thing. But Jerry Park is a buddy of ours at Baylor University, and Jerry and some co-authors created this amazing coding scheme that allows researchers to track religion. One of their categories is called Black Protestant. And essentially what they do is they lump together a great number of historically African-American traditions into one category because of the power of race in American religion, that generally speaking, their logic is correct, that more African-American Protestants, whether you're Methodist or Baptist or Pentecostal, are more similar in a great number of ways as compared to white mainliners and white evangelicals. The problem with that, though, is that if you're African-American and you grew up in a black church and you've been to a Methodist church and a Pentecostal church, you know those ain't the same traditions. So when it comes to looking at the diversity among us, RelTrad is very limited. And so when we get into this notion of Black Protestant, like I said, I'm a Methodist, but I went to Pentecostal churches as a kid in California, and so night and day. Walk into a Black Baptist church, and you get the idea here. So we cannot lump all black folks together, and there is a mainline and evangelical distinction within Black America as well. So we can't just sort of lump together all of those traditions.
Okay, very helpful. So how would you all say then that U.S. evangelicalism is connected to politics from your different vantage points?
Go ahead.
Okay, I want to build on something that you said earlier. Let's just go back to voting. Okay, and so don't get me wrong, I understand there's a whole lot going on in this world about Trump. One of the questions that you told us was coming, though, is how do sociology and political science help us answer the question? In other words, why did white evangelicals vote for Trump, someone who does not share many apparent values with evangelicals? Well, that taps into this question, right? This links between religion and politics in the United States. And this is not a new question. Y'all know for the civil rights movement, black folks and religion been like this for a long time, long before the civil rights movement, black church and a great number of arguments within different denominations. But I'm not the person to sort of, where does sociology come in? So I think for us as researchers, our job is to sort of say, okay, here's the landscape right now in the United States of America since 2016. But let's take a step back and say, what does the data tell us, right? In the long arc of our nation and understanding religion and politics, what does the data say? So last week I was sitting around after I got these questions, and I said, let me go into a data set that I know a lot about, the General Social Survey. And the GSS is great because it allows you to see, it asks you as a respondent who you voted for in presidential elections, right? So I'm able to go back and look and see over the decades, as far back as 1968, the 1968 election, each election to see how people voted for president. And of course, as you said earlier, Rachel, we know that the vast majority of evangelicals vote Republican, right? So there's that quick and easy understanding of that relationship right there. But what does the data say overall about the percentage of white evangelicals who voted Democratic? That's what I wanted to know. We know, generally speaking, they vote Republican, but when do they vote Democratic? So I went back and looked at the data going as far back as the 1968 election. So we know that Jimmy Carter, this makes perfect sense to y'all, right? Jimmy Carter received the highest percentage of votes for any Democratic candidate among white evangelicals in 1976, right? He got 55% of the vote of white evangelicals. This is the all-time high in that data set. Makes perfect sense. As a white evangelical, the first presidential candidate to come out and say, yo, I'm an evangelical and I'm proud, and he gets the vast majority of the white evangelical vote. The next highest time that this happens, Barack Obama received the highest percentage of votes for a Democratic candidate twice since Jimmy Carter, 44%. So I'm sitting there like, okay, all right, I wasn't expecting that. When did it happen, and what about 2016? Hillary Clinton got more votes than all Democratic candidates since 1968, except for Barack Obama, Bill Clinton in 1992, and Jimmy Carter in 76 and 1980. That means she got more votes than Hubert Humphrey, more votes than Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis, Al Gore, and John Kerry. I was pretty surprised by that. And so for me, what this tells me, don't get me wrong, I know some of y'all about to jump all over it, brother, I get it. But the data told me The data tells me, hold up, wait to see what happens in 2020 before we really start to see. Because if Hillary Clinton got more votes than we expected, right? And if Barack Obama did it twice and gave Ohio, my home state, and white evangelicals helped deliver Ohio to Barack Obama, I have to say, okay, let me hold up for a minute and not get caught up in all of this, to wait to see what more of the data says. And so when we talk about this connection between religion and politics, it is clearly a close one, but I do want to sort of take a step back and see what does the data say in the long arc. And in the long arc, there are some interesting signs of a variation even among white evangelicals, particularly since the Obama administration.
Let's not get too positive. When you say more votes, you're definitely not saying a majority of votes except for one of those instances.
Right.
So it's a more robust support, but we're not talking about majority white evangelical support for that Democratic candidate, right?
No, get you on that, no question.
And
that's only happened once.
And so I will temper this forecast a bit, that we have seen massive consolidation between the Republican Party and people who identify as white evangelicals over time. It has grown dramatically over our lifetimes. We've seen a closer relationship, so that people who identify as white evangelical are more and more likely to identify also as Republican. That wasn't the case in 1976. That is the case now, and that's partly because some people, as you can see, have been leaving the identity white evangelical, right? Let me give you two pieces of food for thought on this front. The first is that this relationship between religion and politics is now so tight that the latest political science research, I have long, and even when I've done research on religion and politics in the past, I've always assumed that people's religious identity formed first, and then their political identity flowed from that. But there's more and more experimental research in political science that shows that actually people's political identities are starting to impact their religious identities. It is not the causal direction that I assumed it was. And so I think that's really important to understand, and it's partly about partisanship, right? Because that's really about their political identity is Republican identity. Second, I said this earlier before, but I just want to emphasize it. I said this in an earlier talk, that religion and politics, we can see the close relationship by looking at this issue of immigration. So a lot of people are like, oh, why did white evangelicals vote for Trump when Trump does not represent their moral values or behavior? But actually, and that's because they're thinking they actually think that white evangelicals are voting for Trump because of their abortion agenda. That is not the only thing going on. So if you look prior to Trump, you could see that immigration has become a more salient issue for white evangelicals before Trump, and that for the last 40 years, white evangelicals have been the most conservative religious group when it comes to immigration. And so Trump's immigration agenda is white evangelicals' agenda.
No, you're the social scientist. So.
But you know religion and politics.
Yeah, and you are familiar with this white evangelical world to some extent. So
Yeah.
what does it look like from your angle about the relationship between...
I think there has been several shifts. A lot of people don't remember this, but say in 1970, the big complaint about white evangelicals was that they were apolitical. Mm-hmm. You know? We weren't involved in politics. So a group, I was a part of an early group called Evangelicals for Social Action. And it's got a lot of publicity just because we were talking about justice issues and the like. But our main message to evangelicals, we got to get involved, you know? Mm-hmm. Well, they did get involved. 1980, the moral majority, you know? Mm-hmm. And the big shift there was that for most of the 20th century, evangelicals saw themselves as a cognitive minority on the edges of culture with a spirituality and a theology that equipped them to survive on the edges of culture until Christ returns, you know. And so we were a moral minority. And then all of a sudden in 1980, we announced we were a moral majority without ever explaining what the shifts theologically or the like were. And so there was that shift. And there were, and I think just the fact that we haven't paid attention to what went into changing our views of ourselves theologically and spiritually in that shift, that we're not so clear how you do present yourself or understand yourself. So the real issue, and you both of you used the word today, is identity. You know, who are we as Christians? And I think there is a whole generation whose identity has been primarily formed by the political agenda, the political rhetoric of a certain aspect of the majority culture, so that we you know, you want to look at immigration issues. What does the Bible say about the stranger, about welcoming the stranger? What does the Bible say about who we are as a people drawn from every tribe and tongue and nation who have been made one in Christ, so that race doesn't define us, that ethnicity doesn't define us, that gender doesn't define us, but who we are in Christ? How does all this get played out in an America First, white supremacy, even though I think a lot of my evangelical friends would not endorse those as labels. There's been a trend toward that kind of sense of identity. And so you have a tremendous gap. I mean, you know, I had a student once a white student who wanted to give himself to dealing with issues of justice in the inner city. And he came from a very conservative, white, evangelical church family and an evangelical church. And we were talking one day, and we were just having a conversation. And I said to him, what does your family think about what you want to do? He said, oh, they're very upset with me. And then he started to cry. And he said, I just don't understand it. They're the ones who taught me as a child to sing, wow, Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white. They are precious in his sight. And now they don't want me to work for racial equality. You know? And there's something about the spirituality of this evangelicalism that really is counter to the white supremacy and the America First stuff and the like. And why don't people see it? That's the issue.
That was my next question.
Why don't we see it? And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that our sense of identity has been shaped much more significantly by the rhetoric of a culture that is fearful of the other and is buying into a terrible kind of political rhetoric. Now, that does, I mean, we can talk about people who were shaped by that, but, you know, Franklin Graham was not shaped by that. I mean, he was Billy Graham's son. Billy Graham refused to have segregated rallies. President Clinton said, you know, one of his first lessons in racial equality was when Billy Graham had a rally in Little Rock, Arkansas, and insisted that it be desegregated, and that really made an impression on him. Well, you know, Franklin Graham was around then. That was his father who was insisting on the desegregation. And what's going on with him, I just don't know. nor do I know what's going on with black Pentecostal pastors who are praying over President Trump in the Oval Office. I mean, whatever your politics is, that's a big shift.
Yeah,
and we need to ask what's going on.
Yes, those are very important questions. I'm curious how you all make sense of evangelical support for Trump. You've already talked a little bit about this, but like, what role does race play? From, you know, just thinking about you as a political scientist, how do you describe this kind of the sort of so-called argument that how can evangelicals support someone who apparently doesn't share their values?
So I'll just say again that we see among all evangelicals pretty conservative views when it comes to abortion. And in fact, Latino evangelicals have typically in most surveys the most conservative views when it comes to abortion. So obviously abortion isn't the only thing going into the calculus to support Trump. A lot of people, there's a big discussion both in and outside of academics about the degree to which abortion has been driving conservative white evangelicals to support Trump, that maybe they're most concerned about, let's say, their Supreme Court appointment. I don't buy it, because when you look at survey data, only about 40, a minority, let's say, it's a pretty strong minority, but it's a minority of white evangelicals believe that they would actually vote for a candidate only if that candidate shares their abortion views. So it's not their only or even primary consideration when they step into that ballot box. And second, most white evangelicals don't believe that Trump's Supreme Court appointees is going to overturn Roe. Actually, it's Democrats who think Trump's Supreme Court appointee is going to overturn Roe, but Republicans actually don't believe it. White evangelicals don't believe it. And so I think I've made this argument empirically, it's really race and feelings of racial vulnerability among whites is what is driving their support for Trump.
Janelle, I have a question for you that just would help me. And I think the answers to this are in your book already, but I'm still trying to sort it out. I speak on a number of evangelical college campuses, undergraduates. And John Perkins, who has been a leading black evangelical, much loved in the white community. He got the crap beat out of him in the 60s by white policemen in Mississippi, but he has a very loving attitude, and he's tried to bring people along. But he spoke at Wheaton College, and I was there, and he got a standing ovation from the student body as he talked about the call to racial justice. My sense both in my own student body, which is a graduate school, and in undergraduate schools, is that there's a younger generation that does not share their parents' views about things like immigration and racial justice, and that's a significant thing. Are you hopeful about that at all, or can you help me be hopeful about that? I know you want to maintain your neutrality.
Both political scientists and sociologists have been looking at generational divides within the evangelical church. And on the one hand, you see that younger white evangelicals are slightly more progressive on racial issues than older white evangelicals. That said, the difference between younger white evangelicals and other non-white younger evangelicals is still much, much greater than between the older and between. So whites of any age are way more similar than young people who are white and not white. So there's kind of two answers to that. On the other, and also what we saw, I showed these data earlier today, in 2018, it was still a vast majority of white evangelicals who supported, young white evangelicals between ages 18 and 35 that supported Republican candidates. In 2016, the difference between older white evangelicals and younger white evangelicals in the Trump vote was barely, it was just a few percentage points.
Wow. Do you have anything to add?
Go back to your question again. Can you tell me the question again?
How do you make sense of this whole question of white evangelical support, or let's just even broaden it out, evangelical support of Trump, who is sort of, people will say that there's a discrepancy between, how can people support someone who doesn't seem to represent their so-called values?
So I agree most certainly with the notion that I'll never forget back in 2008 watching it's the middle of the presidential election and watching John McCain, a group of folks in Arkansas who went to a John McCain rally talk about the race between he and Barack Obama and their America. The term that the woman used was "my America" is not what it used to be, "my America." And I just sort of thought, wow, like these white folks really think that if he's elected, that he is going to fundamentally change the scope of American society. And this sense that their nation or her nation, she had this possession that was much deeper than, it was like the end of the world was coming, right? And so I think what we're seeing is there's no question that, don't get me wrong, I most certainly believe that there are a lot of white folks in this country that feel that white America is losing position. You had a black president. You got more people of color coming to this country and making it in America. They're seeing more black folks in positions of power, and they themselves feel like this is my country, and where's my piece of the pie? And they see, supposedly in Donald Trump, somebody who's going to protect that and protect that sense of whiteness and that privilege and all of that. So I acknowledge that, no question about it. But on the flip side of that, let me also say that, like what the data says, most evangelicals have been voting Republican ever since, right? It's the most of our data, as far back as it goes, it tells us that this is what they're going to do in an election. So let me tell one more story real quick. Back at UT Arlington, I teach a number of classes. One of them is Introduction to Sociology. I teach a big class, 250 students. And on election day, or the day before election day in 2016, I was teaching a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, and I always ask my students before an election, I ask them who's going to win. I don't ask them how they're going to vote. I ask them, who do you think is going to win? So with 250 young people across various racial and ethnic backgrounds, UT Arlington is one of the most diverse universities in the country. My class is the melting pot in action in terms of race, religion, sexual orientation, social class, all of that. So to ask these young people, their answer is a great conversation that day. And most of the students thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. But some students said, and I will never forget this, 2 young African Americans stood up and said, Dr. Shelton, I'm not voting in the election. Yeah. How come you're not voting in the election? Because I was voting for Bernie, and Bernie didn't make it, so I'm not voting at all. I'm thinking, okay. And then other people stood up and had similar points to make. Where are you going with this, Jason? What I'm going to say, y'all about to give me again, and I get it. It was funny, pillow talk. My wife and I talking about the election. She didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. She's a Democrat. We put money on Hillary's campaign. Girl, what you talking about you don't want to vote for? We just put some money on her campaign. She said, I wanted Bernie to win, but I'm going to go and vote anyway. Okay, that's pretty interesting. So after the election is over, I always told my students, I said, yo, I bet you Hillary's gonna win. Y'all tripping. We're gonna go to bed before midnight knowing that Hillary Clinton is the first female president of the United States. Imagine what happened when I walked into class on Wednesday. Right? And so it made me realize then. So I think, where am I going with this? I think that a couple of things were operating here. The white evangelical vote came home and did what we expected them to do according to what the data says. They vote Republican. But a great number of Democrats were also dissatisfied with Hillary Clinton as well.
Yeah.
Let's be real, right? Let's be real. That's why I want to see what happens in 2020. If there's a candidate, let's also go back to 2008. And y'all remember when Barack Obama came along, how most people were voting for Hillary Clinton until Barack Obama gave them a reason to vote for him, right? So let's be real about that as well, right? So again, let's wait for 2020 and let's see what the data says then and where we go. How much of whoever, we know that disaffection and dissatisfaction with this president is incredibly high, right? So let's see what percentage of white evangelicals vote Democratic. If this person gets to around 40%, he or she is probably going to win if that's the Democratic candidate. We'll see. So again, I think there are a number of moving parts here. I don't think it's just as simple as the white folks came home and did everything that we expected them to do. That's true to a point, don't get me wrong. But I also think that there's some other things going on with the candidates themselves at that time that help to explain what the outcome of that election.
Yeah, to me, that's very helpful, because I'm still struggling with how much the anti-Hillary sentiment among people who otherwise might vote Democratic enthusiastically was a factor in all of this. And we don't know that yet. And I think you're right that we need to, I mean, it's pretty hard right now to say, well, let's just wait and see how it goes.
I know, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The nation's in trouble.
I mean, if you're telling me to do that, I'll do that.
Right, no doubt.
Okay, I have a final question, and then I'm sure the audience is dying to also ask questions. But I just want to hear briefly your thoughts about like what you think, you've already been speculating about it, but what do you think the future of American Christianity is in light of some of the things? I'm particularly I want to return to the Christianity Today editorial that I referenced, and it's something that you said in your remarks too, Janelle, that we may be seeing this, I don't know, I want to hear what you have to say, but the split between leaders and what we might call elites and the rank and file. What do we make of that? Is that anything to be thinking about in 2020? And then also, at this evangelical rally for Trump, it was also held in Miami with a large number of Latinx attendees. Yeah. So, we have this question of immigration also kind of in the mix, and other racial groups, in addition to these questions of Black Americans and white Americans. So is there anything that really is kind of, that you're thinking about as you think about the future of American Christianity?
You just start with this one, because it's about leaders.
Well, I mean, like, 81% of white evangelicals who voted, and that's an important, that 81% of white evangelicals who voted for Trump. But Janelle, you mentioned some, or you mentioned some other statistics. I mean, I spoke to a group of seminary presidents shortly after the inauguration of President Trump. And they were Catholic, United Church of Christ, United Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, a lot of mainline, but also Pentecostal and more broadly Evangelical, Wesleyan. And but I would take the United Church of Christ, which generally people would say is the most liberal denomination. The seminary presidents were saying that our pastors who graduated from our schools are coming back and saying, help us on this. Our congregations are divided. They may not be divided 80-20, but they're certainly divided 70-30 or something like that. So the number that everyone wants to talk about, 81% of white evangelicals who voted, but no one's talking about the split, say, in the Catholic Church over this. And these are big issues. So there's, in many ways, while in the past we have thought a lot about the split between evangelicals and mainline Protestants, right now he has brought us together. Nixon said he would, and I think Trump finally did it. I will bring you all together. And it's very interesting that the theology that enters in is not very different among United Church of Christ people who voted for Trump and people who call themselves evangelicals who voted for Trump. Washington Post writer told me that she had interviewed a lot of evangelicals, and they did have, when they were asked, and I just need to throw this out, when they were asked how they as Christians could vote for Trump, they did have a biblical answer, that he's like King David, and others say he's like Cyrus, the pagan ruler in the Old Testament, who befriended the Jews and did good things for the Jews. And David, did a lot of bad stuff, but God used him anyway. Those are worth talking about. That isn't stupid, but but they're not really talking about it, you know, because King David repented, you know, and it would be really nice if the President of the United States actually said, "I'm sorry I did these things," you know. So those are differences, and I don't understand all of that, but I think that there may be. I think I'm very curious about the 16% of American white evangelicals who voted for Hillary, because it would be interesting to know whether they represent a demographic slice that will eventually be more prominent. This is what's behind my question for you, because a lot of the people that the younger generation are going to vote more like the 16%, I think, than like the 81%.
Maybe.
Don't mind giving you the last word you want.
No, we're all answering it.
Okay, all right. Yeah. I'm saying
okay.
I'll go first and then you finish
Okay,
it
yeah.
up.
Okay.
So I want to go back to the front part of your question. What is the future of white evangelical Christianity, of evangelical Christianity in light of the Trump presidency? I want to say a couple of things. One, this notion of, we've heard the term identity politics, right? It's kind of, the term is only really applied to people of color until fairly recently. It's like white folks don't do identity politics. Yeah, y'all do.
Yeah.
Right? And we see it right now, right? And so it ain't just a black thing, y'all. So the point here of identity politics is alive and well, and it's just as American as apple pie, right? And so I do want to make that point clear. Another thing, though, I think that this is important to what Janelle said a little while ago. Mark Chaves has this really interesting research. He's the researcher at Duke, where a lot of this research is coming from, of the links. The tradition has been, historically, the idea is that people form their they pick their religion and then they fix their politics according to their religion. What we see now more and more, especially among whites, is the opposite, is that young whites in particular are picking their politics and then melding their religion to fit within their politics. And this is important stuff, and I think it has a lot to do with the future of evangelical Christianity. I think it's one thing the way people voted in 2016, because you couldn't predict what was going to happen once the man became president. Now you see. So how you going to vote now that you've seen it? And now we're going to see what that 16% does. Now we're going to see if there's some other people along the way that say, okay, he does a whole lot of things that are questionable. The debate among Christians, Christianity today, this stuff that's going on in this nation, I don't think a whole lot of people really could have foreseen it was going to be like this. Impeachment today. We ain't even said that word, and y'all know what's going on right now, right? So here we are in the middle of all of this interesting action. How will people vote now? And so now we'll see. And I think that the consequences of this election are important for white evangelical Christians, because it's going to tell us about what the young people in particular, and older people who have been critical of the faith, now will be able to say, what about those contradictions in a very overt way that maybe they didn't have the basis to make that argument before about hypocrisy and contradictions now? That after you know what you saw the last 4 years, you voted this way again? If that happens, then an interesting conversation will emerge related to the future of Christianity. I don't think that that's going to be a big one for African Americans and other people of color within Christianity. But I do think this could be very important for young whites, particularly within evangelical traditions.
So that's a really important question. I did a survey of 10,000 people, but I also did 80 interviews with white, black, Latinx, and Asian American evangelical Christians, and it's interesting to think, like, what role is our pastors and leaders going to have in moving these communities? And it's actually unclear to me, because because when I talk to people, every single person, even though I barely ever heard anyone talking about politics from the pulpit, even though there wasn't a lot of political lobbying in these churches, every person I spoke to knew exactly how their pastor was going to vote. Every single person knew their pastor's position on a range of issues. So it's pretty subtle the way that political information is communicated in all of these churches. That said, actually every single person I spoke to, it was clear to me they're not, the rank and file are not sheep, and they said they will break with their pastor when they don't agree with their pastor. And we saw it when it came to immigration. I think we did see a very visible white evangelical leadership at the national level, and we saw a break with the rank and file, as I mentioned. So people know now what they're dealing with when it comes to Trump. They actually knew in 2018, right? And still in 2018, we saw that it really wasn't just 60% of younger whites. It was in the high 60s. In the high 60s, younger whites were supporting Republican candidates. That doesn't mean they wouldn't reject Trump, but they're not rejecting the ideology of the party yet. I think that is clear. 2 years into that presidency. Now, older white evangelicals, it was in the mid-70s, I would say. So it was a little bit less fervent, but it was still really high for the Republican agenda. So that's after having some information, 2 years of information, right? That's not nothing. I think for the future, race is going to continue to matter a lot in evangelical communities long after this president. And that is really apparent, I think, in some of the data I've shared. And I've mentioned this at an earlier talk. The racial divide there are a lot of racial divides in evangelical America. There's been the long-standing white and black racial divide. I talked today about the divide between whites and non-whites more broadly, but I also see in my data a racial divide between blacks and non-blacks. And that is just as concerning to me in some ways. You see anti-black racism among both Latinx and Asian Americans. And this is not just in evangelical communities, obviously. It's also broader in the general population. So what I think this close look at evangelicals tells us is really they are a lens into racial politics in the U.S. more generally. Everything is intensified within the evangelical church, but we can see it in the nation more broadly.
Wow.
You know, one thing in Janelle's book that was very impressive to me is the fact that the young Latino and African American and Asian American Christians who are evangelicals are really struggling with it because they're aware of the fact. I mean, when you were on NPR, the interviewer asked you, well, why do these people just stay with evangelicals? And you said, well, they actually believe these things, you know. And so there's more struggle going on between evangelical convictions and my political life in these non-white evangelical communities than there is in the white evangelical community, I think. Yeah.
Every single person I spoke to, when asked what is more salient for you, what is most important to you, your religious identity or your racial identity, every single person who is evangelical said, my religious identity is the most important identity.
Amen.
Wow, interesting. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions. We have about 10 minutes. I see 3 hands, so I'm going to take 3 questions to begin. Is the microphone, do I see Bradley? Okay, so we're going to go 1, 2 in the back, 3, and then I have a 4th question here. So, okay, let's go with that. 1, 2, 3, 4.
In the middle. Okay.
I'm James Wallace. I'm a professor at Boston University. Robert Putnam, in his book American Grace, made an interesting assertion that the most integrated interracial church communities in America were megachurches. And first question, do you agree or not agree with that? Second, some of these churches have an inordinate influence on the political discourse. And do you think that interracial, interethnic nature of those megachurches influences or doesn't influence the political discourse coming out of those congregations?
Yes, I do. So I said earlier this afternoon in my talk, when my wife and I lived here in Houston, when I was a fellow, we went to Joel Osteen's church a couple of times. I wanted to see what it was like to go to church in a basketball arena, right? That was something else. But you notice the melting pot in that church. And in the DFW area, the Potter's House, T.D. Jakes' church. You walk in, the melting pot. I mentioned earlier in the beginning of tonight's talk, in my moments, I talked about how non-denominational African-American Protestants are twice as likely to vote for Republican presidential candidates. I don't have the data. My gut feeling tells me, and I can do it, this is after I finish writing the current book that I'm writing, I can connect the general social survey data that I'm analyzing with the National Congregation Study, Mark Chave's data set down at Duke, and it will allow me to look to see the size of those non-denominational Protestant congregations. And my guess is those African Americans who go to those churches, he's got some great data that tells you the size of the church and also the racial composition of the church. And my guess is that, again, like I said earlier, the melting pot in action, that a big chunk of those African-American non-denominational Protestants voting Republican attend large, multiracial, non-denominational churches. Yeah. And so I think you're exactly right with what you're saying.
But there are, I think you would agree, there are large megachurches, or there are megachurches where the political discourse, like say Rick Warren,
yes,
or Bishop Jakes,
yes.
That is very different than some of the more.
Yes, I agree. I do.
There's a healthy political.
There is, but in my talk earlier today, I showed the room statistics about racial solidarity and how non-denominational Protestants, black folks who are non-denoms, over the generations have felt less close to other African Americans, yeah, and much closer to other whites. Yeah. All right. Now you see this most prominently among non-denoms who are African American. Something's going on there, yeah, right? And something is going on. And I think I'm trying to figure out, and I haven't finished writing the book yet, but my argument so far is essentially there's a theology of sort of humanity in there that, we can be cool with white folks and still love black people too. There's sort of this, I think, underlying universalism. Again, beauty is in the eye of the beholder on this. I think this is a great thing in theory, most certainly so. I believe in the fellowship of humanity, as Dr. King said, but we still got the problem of racial inequality. Yeah. So you can't have a fellowship of humanity and kumbaya and still step in any hood, United States of America, and have disproportionately poor black folks, and they're stuck there. Amen. That's my big problem.
Okay, back there.
I was recently listening to a podcast by Deconstructed with Mehdi Hassan, and he was interviewing Noam Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky said that back in the 70s, that's when anti-abortion was first introduced, to the political atmosphere, hold on, I wrote my question down. So that sentiment was adopted in the early 70s, and basically it's like politicians kind of honed in on this demographic that was otherwise untapped. And if so, does the Trump vote equal the evangelical vote? Because it sounds like they just convinced them that that was the same vote, but it really isn't, and I feel like that makes me uncomfortable as a voter, because we're all kind of being manipulated. That's just I don't know, would you agree, or how do you feel about that? Because zooming out, I think the evangelical vote wasn't anti-abortion until politicians told them it was.
So one of the things that, yes, abortion was inserted into politics and associated with the evangelical vote, but during that same time, segregation and maintaining segregation in public schools was also a big part of the discourse and underlies, I think, white evangelicals' longstanding and initial connection to the Republican Party. That was part of the mobilization that happened. That was along with abortion, and there's a lot of good writing on this. But I said earlier, I don't think abortion is driving white evangelical support for Trump. It's part of it, but I think that racial anxiety is also a big part of, and I mean, I don't think so. I see in various analyses, not just my data, but many, many other people have shown that it's, while abortion is a big part of people's consideration, it's not the only driver. It may not be the main driver. And we see other evangelical groups that aren't white that think abortion is really, really important, and they're not supporting Trump.
That's interesting. Okay, did you have a question, Bradley? Do you want to bring the mic?
Is this on now?
Can you hold the mic?
Hold the mic, please. This on now?
Yeah, it's on there.
Okay, I get it. Okay.
I'll keep on. You're right.
My name is, I'm Ben Ball from Sugar Land, Texas. The January 9th, 2020 issue of the New Republic carried the following headline: The Evangelicals Who Pray for War with Iran. The article carried references to Armageddon, apocalyptic theology, the rapture, and the second coming. I appreciate your comments.
What was the first part of it, the headline?
Headline?
The evangelicals who prayed for war and were urging war with Iran.
Yeah. I mean, this is another factor, and that is the pro-Israeli, the theological history of pro-Israeli politics in the evangelical world. There's a whole theology that, that God has his hand on Israel and will bless Israel, and if you're at all critical of Israeli policy, then God will curse those who curse Israel, and God will bless those who bless Israel. And so this too, there is an apocalypticism.
Yeah.
I think that, the oddity here, and I want to say there with the previous question as well, the thing that I find so difficult is that a group of Christian people who can support Israel no matter what will at the same time not be speaking out against anti-Semitism. And that the people who claim that they love unborn children will tolerate what's been happening to little babies and little children on the border of the United States and Mexico. There's something weird about that we really do need to talk about.
Yeah. Okay, we just had one final question. We're out of time, so we'll just take one question.
Okay. Are there any in here? Yeah, in here, like on the panel.
I'm not.
You? Okay. Well, the question will be for you. How does the evangelical religion or Christianity as a whole positively impact Black and brown communities, and what role does integration play in all of this?
How does evangelical faith, how has it positively impacted African American communities and Hispanic communities?
And integration.
When Blacks and Hispanics outnumber white evangelicals in Christianity, how do they represent us as a status quo?
Yeah. Well, I mean, these are big questions, and evangelical Christianity of the sort that as I defined it early on, in many ways shares a whole tradition with, say, the Black church. The Black church doesn't always like the label evangelical because it associates it with white. And so a much more typical term is Bible believers. But in many ways, if you look into what Bible believers, and you gave us those things, you know, well, you got to evangelize, you got to witness, you got to be born again, so that the and within the Hispanic community, the big growth in the last couple of decades has been in the Latino community with the growth of Pentecostalism, which is often in tension within barrios with Catholicism. And so that's a very big issue right now, Pentecostal Catholic relations. And this present Pope has been very concerned about that in Latin America, but it's also true in Los Angeles. It's true in Chicago, and and it's true in Houston, that there are tensions within the Hispanic community between Catholic and Pentecostal, especially. Asian American, you know, is a whole different world, because in many ways the Asian American community has been very much influenced by, say, certainly out of South Korea, by Presbyterianism of a very conservative sort. And so that's a slightly different strand of evangelicalism, although there's increasing Korean Pentecostalism, for example. Pentecostalism has grown not so much in the Chinese American community, but in the Korean American community. And the Japanese American community is yet
So just so I'm clear, he doesn't actually have a response to the question. He kind of sidestepped.
I'm sorry, what was?
You know what I'm saying? Because like you kind of sidestepped the question, right? So the question was dealing with blacks and Hispanics because they are the majority in Christianity and in Christian evangelicals.
Yeah.
Right? So how, because we've heard a lot about white evangelicals in this panel. So how does that represent the status quo or the norm in the community of the average person that represents the community that you're supposedly representing?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And the fact is that globally, we white evangelicals are in a very small minority compared to the Southern Hemisphere, for example. But in the United States, and this is where, you know, somebody did a study of congregations in Boston, and that there are fewer churches in Boston than there were 34 years ago. But they found out that that wasn't true because they did the survey by phone, and a lot of Nigerian churches and Haitian churches didn't answer the phone and do the survey. There are very large Haitian, Nigerian, you know, so no, we are a very small minority, and we ought not to be dominating the agenda of evangelicalism.
I'm going to let Janelle have the last word on this one.
Well, so the research I did looked at that. What are the differences between the political? So there's people who are among those, let's just say evangelicals, not Christians as a whole. White evangelicals aren't, they're actually in that tradition still a majority of evangelicals. There's about 30% of evangelicals who are Black, Latinx, and Asian American. And the white agenda doesn't represent the political views at all of Black, Asian, or Latinx evangelicals. There's a huge disparity. In fact, the mainstream agenda is counter to a lot of the interests that Black and brown evangelicals prioritize. And so part of that, this panel was also to try to highlight that there isn't exactly what you're saying. There isn't a correspondence or representation. The white evangelical agenda, at least the conservative agenda, is not representing, and that's why we see the divides we see. And those divides are not just in the church.
Yeah. One last thing, because what you said was very important. Could we say that that's being represented in our immigration policy because of what they're doing on the border with separating these families, these kids from their parents, and then when President Trump says, you know, we would want more people coming in from Wales and, you know, the white countries. So what you're saying is spot on. Yeah. Could you say the representation of that is happening right now in our White House?
Yes. It's a good, yes. So,
There was actually a second part to the question, sorry.
Okay, I'm actually going to need to cut you off, but you have added something really important to this conversation Thank you for raising the real kind of issues that are at stake in terms of Black and brown communities and how this relates to this larger conversation with evangelicals. And I just want to thank all of you for coming tonight. Thank you so much for your attentiveness. I know the panelists will be sticking around if you want to have further conversation, and we've only just scratched the surface when it comes to race and evangelical politics.